Welcome to On Point. I'm Monica Trauzy. Joining me today is Jake Schmidt, Director of International Programs at the Center for Clean Air Policy. Jake, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Jake, during last month's Bali climate conference, the Bush administration announced it would be holding another major emitters meeting at the end of January in Hawaii. What are your expectations for the Hawaii meeting?
I think it's important to keep in mind the broader context in which the major economies meeting is unfolding. You know, in the Bali debate, we launched a process to negotiate the formal elements of the post-2012 agreement. And many Europeans and developing countries have been very adamant in saying that the major economies meeting needs to contribute to that debate and to feed in some technical inputs. And a number of countries are trying to figure out sort of how the major economies process fits into that debate and how it moves forward the Bali process on negotiating the post-2012 agreement by the end of 2009, as we agreed.
So, does it help that process along, or does it sort of get in the way? What's your take on these major economies meetings?
Well, I think it's hard to tell right now. There's a lot of uncertainty around these meetings. I think there's a number of critical elements that these meetings could do over the next 2 years, but there's also a process launched in Bali that will have a number of meetings as well to talk about the further actions of all developed countries, the further commitments of developing countries, the approaches for technology transfer and development, as well as adaptation. And I think, you know, as many people sort of recognize, and as we've been working with government and industry throughout the world, many of the critical elements in Bali are on the table, and the major economies meeting, you know, if it can contribute to those, will be very useful. But everybody around the world has been very adamant in saying that the major economies meeting needs to feed into the UN process, and that the final agreement and final deal is within the UN process.
And the Bush administration is still using the word aspirational. Is that a problem, especially for the international community?
Well, I think for many of the international community, the word aspirational means different things. And I think it's important to translate some of these words into practical actions. And one of the sea changes in Bali that I think will be useful to build upon is the developing countries. For the first time, developing countries stepped up to the plate and said, we'll take real, measurable, verifiable actions in the next round, and that's pretty significant. And I think as we move forward, you need to keep in mind sort of how does all this stuff add up in terms of the global agreement, and does this aspirational, and what steps and actions are both the developed and developing countries taking in the 2020-2030 timeframe.
Were you at all surprised by the level of disagreement that occurred at Bali when it came to the United States?
Not dramatically surprised. I mean, I think many people have got a growing awareness of the political dynamics emerging within the U.S. and elsewhere. And I think one of the things that many people have become greater aware of in the international community is the nuances within the U.S. debate around Congress and the administration and how you sort of approach those issues. And I think as the congressional debate unfolds, how the targets discussion and how the developing country approach sort of unfolds in that will play a very influential role in people's thinking about what's the U.S. place on the table. And having a bit more of sort of a nuanced strategy to developing countries, I think, is something that sort of grew out of the Bali debate, where we have a set of systems put in place to recognize developing countries' unilateral actions and then providing them with a set of incentives for going further. And I think that's something we could build upon.
And how much of the future success of this process is dependent on those developing countries signing on to specific emissions targets?
Obviously, it's very critical for two very important reasons. One, from the political context of moving developed countries forward. Developed countries have been very adamant, in particular in the U.S., in saying we can't move forward without developing countries doing something, but also from an environmental standpoint. But I think it's fair to look at what's actually happening on the ground. For the issues for developing countries that arose in Bali is this growing awareness that they're actually taking actions pretty significantly. We released a report in Bali that found in China, Brazil, and Mexico, laws adopted on the books today, if fully implemented, would achieve emission reductions that would be not surpassed by the Lieberman-Warner bill until around 2020. And that's pretty significant, and that's something that's giving them sort of a greater awareness. And so as we think to the future, we clearly need to build in a system that recognizes these actions and provides incentives. And we clearly need the leadership of developed countries, because for many developing countries, the leadership of the U.S. in particular and other developed countries is a crucial sort of stumbling block for them taking on further actions. But they're moving forward despite the blockage of the U.S. at this point, and I think it's important to recognize that as we go forward.